You're listening to Online Pet Health Podcasts with Dr. Megan Kelly. Continuing education for veterinarian rehabilitation therapists. Learn more at onlinepethealth.com.
Hey Vetrehabbers! Today I chat to Leilani Alvarez from the Animal Medical Center in New York. We chat about research that she did looking into referring veterinarians' perceptions and reasons for referring patients to veterinary rehabilitation facilities. Now, some of the results of the survey I found really interesting. We discussed why the most common answer for why vets are not referring was due to cost. Leilani also looks into the cost of other specialists, and what she found was really surprising. Her biggest take home from the study was that there is a need for continuing education in small animal rehabilitation for veterinarians. Now, before I head over to the interview with Leilani, a quick word from our sponsors. Now, choosing the right therapy laser and PEMF systems for your practice are really big decisions. That's why our Response system has been helping to make that decision easier for you for over 35 years. They offer Class 3B and Class 4 lasers, as well as a full line of PEMF products, and they're designed for both small animals and horses. And as an extra bonus, all the systems are fully rechargeable and adapted for international grids. So you can find out more at responsesystem.com. You can come and chat to Response System at the Vet Rehab Summit, our online veterinary rehabilitation conference on the 14th of November this year. You can find out more at vetrehabsummit.com. If all your conferences are cancelled or postponed, you are not going to want to miss this one. Now, over to Leilani. Hey, Leilani, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Leilani, we've obviously had you on the podcast before. For those listeners that don't know much about you, can you let us know how you got into the field of veterinary rehabilitation?
Sure. I work currently at the Animal Medical Center. We're the largest nonprofit veterinary hospital in the world, actually. It's a big place. We have over 100 veterinarians. I originally did my internship here in the early 2000s, back in 2002, and then worked in general practice, did emergency medicine, and was looking to offer more than I could with the tools that I had. I pursued acupuncture certification, and then my work actually encouraged me to pursue Rehab certification, which I was delighted to do. And then after I became Rehab certified, I came back to the Animal Medical Center to run the Rehab department here.
And you're obviously, for those of us that know you, you've published quite a lot of research. And recently you published research, but I didn't know you published this article about veterinary referrals. And that's why I actually wanted to get you on the podcast today. So you published this article where you did a survey to vets, finding out why they are referring or not referring. Can you tell us a little bit about what actually got you to start doing this research?
Yes, I was delighted, Meg, when you asked me to do this podcast, because this was actually the first research article that I published. It's an article that was published in JAVMA, so that's the Journal of the American Veterinary Medical Association, back in 2016. And the reason I did this research was because of the shortcomings I had myself in rehabilitation and trying to understand why veterinarians do and do not refer. It seemed that I had some veterinarians that were very eager to refer to me, and I had no difficulty in getting them to consistently refer, while other veterinarians that I knew had a lot of confidence in me as a veterinarian, they didn't seem to refer as much for rehab. And while those individual conversations are helpful, I really was interested in understanding if there was a pattern nationwide. And I was really also hoping to help my colleagues, my rehab colleagues who struggle in obtaining those referrals from certain groups of veterinarians. So this survey was an attempt to understand why veterinarians as a group do and do not refer for rehabilitation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a problem globally. So worldwide, vet rehabbers are always asking, I'm struggling to get referrals. Does anyone have any tips or ideas? So it's great that you did this research. And actually, the reason that I found the research is because I was thinking, I myself need to do this. I need to do a survey asking vets, what's going on in their minds. So what are the questions that you ask them?
It was a very simple survey. One of my goals was to get a lot of respondents. I think the more participation you have, the more weight it has, right? If you only sample a small group of people, then, is that representative of the whole population? So I only had 10 questions. It was meant to be something that could be filled out in less than a minute. And so they were fairly straightforward questions. If you access the article, which I'll send to you, Meg, and you're welcome to share it with anybody who would like, was, tell us how long you've been in practice. Where do you work? So I took demographics of our respondents. So I wanted to know, are you a young veterinarian who's recently out of school, or have you been in practice for 15 or 20 years? Do you work at a general practice, or do you work at a specialty hospital? So I had some demographic questions to begin with. And then I asked, how many cases have you referred in the past 12 months? I wanted to know, have you referred? And of course, an option was if you've never referred, and I actually really wanted to capture those veterinarians who had never referred to rehabilitation. And then I asked for those who had referred what types of cases they were referring. And I gave them options of, was it orthopedic? Was it postoperative? Was it neurological? Was it that the patient hadn't been using the leg in a long time? So we asked those questions. And then the big question, of course, was why have you not referred? Like, why are you not referring? What are the biggest obstacles? Interestingly, I did this survey first after a lecture I had given. It was a community lecture that I gave here at the Animal Medical Center. And I had an audience of, it was like a little bit less than 40 people. And I distributed the survey then. And I gave them an option to write in another option. If the options I gave them was not there, they could write in an option. So for the question, what are the obstacles? Why are you not referring to rehabilitation? People wrote in that it was cost. And I hadn't even thought that was a reason why veterinarians might not refer to rehab. And so I used that as my pilot survey, and then I actually adjusted the questions for the larger survey that I sent nationwide. And so then I gave the option of cost. And as it turns out, that was the number one reason why veterinarians are not referring to rehabilitation is perception of cost.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, because if you look at all the other professions, within veterinary, we're not really that expensive, are we?
Interestingly, I became so fascinated with the high response of this option. People saying, I'm not referring to rehabilitation because rehab is so expensive. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't think of rehab as being so expensive. And so it got me to do further research on my own. And so I reached out to our chief financial officer here at our hospital, and I asked him to send me some statistics about what our average daily cost is for services, both by day, by client, by year, by month, and compare that to other specialty services in the hospital. We're a referral and specialty practice, but we actually also have a general practice. And as it turns out, rehabilitation has the lowest average cost of any other department, including general practice. So we have a lower cost per service, per client, per day, per month, per year. Basically, every figure that I asked them to look at, we were the most affordable, actually. And in particular, when you look at the amount of time that we spend directly with the client. So how much time does the veterinarian or the therapist spend directly with the patient? There's no other department that spends as much time with them, yet we charge the least. And so I thought, wow, are we undercharging then? There's a perception that we're costly. So I thought, what, before I make any conclusions, let me ask. So the way that I conducted the survey, just so that everybody understands, I didn't just randomly reach out to veterinarians. I did this through the American Association of Rehab Veterinarians, so AARV, helped me in this survey in that they allowed me to reach out to all AARV members. So these are, rehab veterinarians. I asked them if they wanted to participate in the survey. So just like you, Meg, you're saying, I want to do this research because I want to understand my own community.
Yeah.
And so that's how we presented it to these rehab certified veterinarians is if you would like to better understand why you are or are not receiving referrals from your community, then what we're asking is that you share your referral vet list with us, so with me, and then we send the survey to all of those veterinarians. So in other words, we had we had 9 participating rehab practices nationwide. And each of those practices sent me their referral list. So this included veterinarians who had and had not referred to them, but they were what they perceived to be in their span geographically, where they would have expected the veterinarians should be referring to them, but in many cases they were not. So that is who we sent the survey to. It was the referral list from those 9 participating practices around the nation. And they were all over the place. So we had some out west, we had some in the middle of the country, we had some in the Northeast. And I sent the survey to almost 3,000 people. And so that was who we were targeting, is potential veterinarians who could refer. And then some of them were referring and some of them weren't.
So where do you think this perception that our treatments are costly comes from?
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Let me go back to what I was saying, is that so I reached out to those 9 practices
Yeah.
and I asked them, "Oh, tell me about how your rehab costs compare to either within your practice if you're in a specialty practice, or just your surrounding community. Like, what are the costs of veterinary care in your surrounding community?" And it was very interesting for them. They came back to me with the exact same results I had, which is that they were the most affordable service comparatively to other rehab services, particularly when you compare to specialty practice. And then to answer your other question about why do I think that is, I feel pretty confidently about my answer here, Meg, based on this survey, which is that it's lack of education. I think this is coming from a lack of understanding of what services we offer, and in particular, the value of those services.
Yeah. So they don't see the value, because if they saw the value, it wouldn't seem costly to them.
Exactly. Because in fact, compared to other veterinary services, it's one of the most affordable.
Yeah.
So it's a perception. It's not a true cost. And that's why even the title of my paper is Perceptions, because I'm surveying people's opinions, right? It's not that the cost is high. It's that it's their perception that the cost is high. And of course, what that tells you is, well, it's a lack of understanding and value. Yeah. And it's very interesting because over the years, I've worked on many different committees, both for the American Association of Rehab Veterinarians, as well as for the college, our college that allows us to be specialists in this service. So the American College of Veterinary Sports Medicine and Rehabilitation, I've served on committees with them as well to try to understand why veterinarians want to become specialists. And so, in any case, I participate a lot in understanding our community. And it's very interesting to me because on one of these committees, I learned that some of the growing pains that we have had in rehabilitation are similar to what was experienced in veterinary medicine and emergency medicine, when veterinarians are practicing emergency medicine. And then this college formed of criticalists. And so now these veterinarians have advanced training. And why should somebody spend more money to see the board certified criticalist when you can go and see an emergency veterinarian? And the same for a client, right? So it's a perception of, why would a veterinarian refer to the specialist as opposed to a veterinarian who works in an emergency room but doesn't have any specialized training necessarily? And also, why would a client pay more money to see that specialist? And it's very interesting because this came out in the committee as we were discussing that it took education. It was about getting out in the conferences and educating veterinarians about the difference in level of training and the value, of course, right? What is the value of seeing a board certified criticalist when you have an emergency? And I think it's similar now when our patients are having a postoperative surgery and the surgeon is saying, your dog is doing great, it's not necessary to do rehab. And then you think, well, what happens when you have an orthopedic surgery yourself as a human? It's standard of care to see a physical therapist because we know it improves your recovery. So it's not that, you're having a poor recovery, so then now you see the physical therapist. It's because I want to ensure your best outcome. I'm going to send you to the physical therapist. So I think what's missing here is education and understanding of the value of our services. It's not about refer to us when your patient isn't having a good recovery. It's refer your patient to us because we can get you a better outcome. the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that you mentioned is you were looking at the types of people. So is it new graduates? Is it people that have been in the field for longer? And, if I think back to my days in veterinary school, we didn't learn anything about rehabilitation. We had, like half a day on like hydrotherapy, and a few other things, but I really can't remember anything. Everything I learned was after I'd qualified and when I went and did my CCRP. And, I wondered to myself, is there a difference between the ages of vets that are out there? Because those vets that know nothing about it, all right, let's say they have no knowledge whatsoever, and those are the ones which are harder to convert, right? So now we try and have to show them our value, and we now come with this completely new field, which they don't really recognize because they weren't taught it at university. So how could it actually be anything? They were taught everything that they needed to know, although the field of veterinary is changing. The field of veterinary rehabilitation has changed, in the last 10 years, amazingly, and we haven't been around for that long. So did you find that the younger vets were referring more and more open to veterinary rehabilitation because maybe they had a better knowledge compared to the vets that qualified years ago?
Yes, it's an excellent point, and that is what I had thought as well. Interestingly, at least from the results in my survey, so we had a little bit under 500 veterinarians respond, and keep in mind again that we did have veterinarians who had never referred, but the majority of the veterinarians responded had referred at least one patient in the past year. And so, one of the things to always keep in mind is this representative of the whole U.S. veterinary population? I can't say definitively that it does, but I will share with you the results that I had, which were a little bit eye-opening. So I also thought that older veterinarians who had no exposure to rehabilitation in their education would be less likely to refer. Demographically, what we found in our respondents is that it was the middle of the road. So it wasn't the fresh grad, the one who had no experience. And it also was not the veterinarian who's been practicing for 20 years. It was people who'd been practicing, as I recall, I think it was more than 2 years, but less than 5. So it was a few years out of school. And also we did find that veterinarians who worked in specialty hospitals were also more likely to refer than veterinarians who were in general practice. So both of those were findings, is a little bit of experience. And when I thought about it, well, that makes sense, because as a fresh grad, you're a little bit shy about, making that big referral to a specialist. That's not that common, particularly if your colleagues that you're working with are not referring for rehab. Then as the new person in the team, you're not likely to do it. But as you've been working for a few years, I think you gain confidence as a veterinarian, and especially if you had some exposure in school and you're familiar with rehabilitation, you might be more likely to refer. So that's what we found is just being out for a few years and working among specialists. Those veterinarians were more likely to refer.
Yeah, I suppose they're used to referring, so that's normal for them.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Really, really interesting. Yeah, and I wonder, those older vets, I think they get to a point where they realize things have advanced so much that they need to learn more and open their minds. So I think vets get to a point, there's a point where they think they know everything and they think they're on top of their game, and then things start to, as they get more and older, if they haven't kept up to date with their CPD or CE, then maybe they become a little bit more open-minded. Go for it.
Yeah, what I was going to offer is that in my clinical experience, one way I think to get referrals, without question, I think it's education, but that education can only go so far if the veterinarian is not attending those CE events, just as you said. If a veterinarian has been practicing for 25 years and they feel like they know everything and they're not attending their CE. In many places in the world, it's required that you do CE. But what I have found is a form of education is anytime that you have a patient, particularly those patients that come to you on their own, so they're not a referral, the client finds you and that patient comes to you on your own, and then you ask them, who's your primary care veterinarian? Use that as an opportunity to educate them, because that patient has come to you, and then you can develop this relationship with this veterinarian who's never referred to you, and they in fact didn't refer this patient to you, but you're treating their patient. And if you approach it as we are on the same team, and I'm going to send you this patient back when it needs blood work or when, it's having itchy skin. I'm going to send it back to you, and we're going to form this relationship. And I'm going to use this as an opportunity to let you know what I'm doing with this patient. This patient's older and was having a lot of difficulty getting up, and now it's been coming for rehab sessions, and now it can get up by itself. And that's so great, because now the patient's going to live longer. They're going to see you more often. Instead of being euthanized. And I think using every patient as an opportunity to educate your community of veterinarians is a wonderful way to educate, because it's an example that they can relate to. It's a patient they know, and they've seen that patient struggle, and then they see the results of seeing you and how much they've benefited from that. And that can be a wonderful opportunity for education.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, one of the things that I think we need to be mindful of is those vets that don't have that knowledge about what we do. It must be quite daunting for them making that referral, because the problem is let's say they refer, and then the client goes to the vet physio or vet rehab therapist, and then they come back, the client then comes back asking the vet a whole lot of questions. And then it makes them look stupid because they don't know the answers. And I wonder whether that's one of the reasons that vets are not referring, just because it's actually easier not to try and broach the subject with the pet owner. And the pet owner might right away, when they make that referral, start asking questions. And there's always this perception that vets know everything, and like a prime example is in my family. My husband we'll be out at a barbecue or braai or at dinner or something, and somebody will mention a butterfly or something, and then they'll be like, let's ask Megs. Like, they've got a question about the life cycle of a butterfly, or like what type of butterfly it is. And let's ask Megs, she's a vet. And I'll be like, I have no idea, And like, there's this perception, if you're a vet, you know everything about every single animal,
Yeah.
And obviously now we specialize a little bit more. So like, it's sort of okay now not to know something about ophthalmology because they're a specialist,
Yeah.
and not to be able to do every orthopedic op because they're specialists. But they're still in the pet owner's eyes. You're the vet, you know everything,
It's such a great Yeah, it's such a great point, and I experienced the same thing. I feel like, everybody in my family asks me their own medical questions, and I have to remind them I'm not a human physician. Yeah, I think it goes all the way from I'm supposed to know what, insects, do, and how long they live, and, what mosquito life cycle is. I'm like, I don't know that. But what's very interesting, Meg, coming back to the survey, is one of the questions I asked veterinarians is, what would be the most likely type of patient that you would consider for future referral to rehabilitation? And they cited neurologic disorders. And I think it's for the same reason that you just mentioned, is when veterinarians have a patient who can't walk because they have a disc or they have degenerative myelopathy, it's daunting, and they are at a loss for how to help this patient. And so I think it goes back to exactly what you said, which is we as veterinarians want to have the answer, and we want to solve the problem. And if we don't know how to do that, it puts us in an uncomfortable place. But I think as rehab veterinarians, I took that and I ran with it, because I was like, oh, this is brilliant information. Now I know that I need to be advertising to veterinarians that send me those neuro patients who you don't know what to do with. Send them to me. I can help these patients. And it's great to know the patients that veterinarians would want help with. What types of patients do you feel like you can't treat them on your own? They're more difficult, because I think even though the majority of previous referrals in my survey had been for postoperative rehabilitation, when I asked them, what would you most likely refer to in the future, it was neuro. And it makes sense, because postoperative, that's the most logical. The most logical patient that would get rehab is the postoperative, TPLO. But the one that veterinarians need the most help with is the neuro patient, in fact.
Yeah, and if you think about business, all right, any business that's out there, their businesses are created to solve problems, all right? And that's what we have to focus on. So when we start with this relationship and this connection with the vets, we want to say to them, what are your biggest problems you're having now? Like, with what cases are your biggest problems? And those neuro cases, I mean, first of all, they're hectic in the hospital. You're having to move a paralyzed dog around or paralyzed cat around, express bladders. So if you hospitalize and you're able to take that on, like somebody else can do that, that's even better.
Yeah.
And like you say, they're at a loss because the client wants answers. And let's say they can't afford surgery, or let's say they've even had surgery and they're not improving. They don't know what else to do. They've used everything in their toolbox.
Yeah.
And this is a continual problem for them. They've got the owner, they're thinking, they're worried about this case. So I think really approaching vets and finding out, instead of, what we tend to do is we go to them and we say, these are all the things we can treat. Actually go to them and say, what are your problem cases? What are your neurological and musculoskeletal cases that you are struggling with at the most?
Yeah.
And then they answer you and then say, well, this is how I can help you.
Exactly.
And they'll be like, relief, like take them from me, and then that will start your relationship, and then it'll start. They'll start to realize.
That's brilliant, because that goes back to exactly what we were saying, which is use that veterinarian you already know and use that as an opportunity to educate them. And that's brilliant also to ask them, where are you struggling? I can say, for example, here at my hospital, we get a lot of referrals from critical care and even internal medicine with these chronically ill patients who, maybe their primary problem is chronic kidney disease, but that's made them very weak and now they're struggling to get up. And if we can help with that aspect, we're making their job much easier.
Yeah. What are the other things that the vets were worried about? So what are the other things, like you said that you had a whole list and then you added in that cost? What are the other things that you had in there?
So I had, for example, dogs who've been persistently non-weight bearing. We had the postoperative patients. We had geriatric patients as an option as well. So those were the main categories. It was postoperative orthopedic, neurological disorders, chronically non-weight bearing, and older patients.
Okay. And the reasons that vets are not referring, so your most common one was cost.
Yeah. The biggest one was cost, and of course it's perception of cost, as we've been talking about. And again, just to emphasize, we can get back to this later, but one of the questions I asked, which I want us to chat about, is I asked them if they would be interested in having more educational opportunities. So we can come back to that. But so number one was cost. Veterinarians felt that the number one reason they were not referring to rehab was cost. They perceive it to be very expensive. The second most common reason was they didn't have a rehab facility near them, so that it was a long commuting time to get to the rehab. And so it was inconvenience of travel. That was number two.
Yeah. I mean, location is an issue. So they want everything to be convenient for their clients, right? So for them to recommend that a client must drive 45 minutes an hour, that's not going to be a good recommendation for their clients.
Yes, but interestingly, one thing that we have found in the United States is, and I gather this is probably true worldwide, is again, it's this perception of value, because we all know at the universities, people travel a long distance. And I know Sherman Knapp, for example, and even here I receive international people, and it's because they've heard about you, and they'll travel across the world to see you. It's worth it, right? So it's value. So people will travel. It's a matter of, is it worth the trip? And this is where, again, getting yourself out there, giving, free educational events to local veterinarians, writing articles, making sure that people know your name and what you do, because then the veterinarians will say, you know what, I know it's an hour's drive for you, but, Dr. Meg is amazing and she's well worth the trip. You will not regret it. And you need to make this trip. So if it's presented by the veterinarian as worthwhile, even though it's far away, the client will make that trip. And we know that from rehab. We get the type of client that comes to us is a highly dedicated client. And particularly when you're thinking about sporting dogs, these clients are just, they'll do absolutely anything for their pet. And travel is the least of their concern. They travel for events, for sporting events. So traveling to see somebody who has a higher level of training that could help their dog, they will do that.
And what do you think about trust? So, if that vet rehab therapist is not known well, so let's say they haven't published articles or they haven't been in magazines or newspapers, and they are thinking about referring. For the vet, often, it's they're the ones who are liable in the end. If they refer a patient, they're the ones, if something goes wrong, the client is going to be upset with them, and potentially from a governing body, they could be responsible, depending on where you are in the world.
True.
So was that one of the things that you questioned? Like, is it trust of the vet rehab therapist that is concerning to them?
I did actually ask that question. It was, I think, one of the lowest response rates, if not the lowest. I did ask that question, and that was not cited. Of course, maybe it's also something that's hard to admit. You have to always keep in mind that surveys, there's a bias in reporting from the person who's answering the survey, because you have a perception of yourself, and so saying you don't trust somebody is maybe something hard to admit. I do think that's an issue, and I think it's really interesting that you brought that up, because I have found over the years that that's made a huge difference in my referral base. It is that trust. It's the confidence that the veterinarians have with me and the good results that they have had in referring previous patients, because you're absolutely right. It's a reflection of them and how the experience that the client has. And so it's really, really important that we build those relationships with the referring vet community to build that trust. And I think the best way to do that is to make sure you keep in close communication with them. And in particular, if there's something that you can send the patient back to them, that really builds trust, because they are relying on their own business structure. And so you can support each other. And that was one of the categories I had is, are you afraid of losing a client? Is that a reason you're not referring? Is that you're afraid of losing business? And that was, again, not the top reason, not even the second top reason, but that was sort of middle of the road. People did answer that as a reason why they weren't referring, is the perception that they could be losing business that they could potentially capture themselves.
Yeah, going back to that trust, if I think back to practice, what I really used to do is use the pet owners to help with that connection and that relationship that I build with the pets. And, the pet owner, they're the ones who are going to be spreading word of mouth about you. So if they have a great experience with you, what you want them to do is go and actually tell the vet.
Right.
I always used to say to them, I work together with your vet. And if I just sent a report, I would say, I've been in communication with Dr. Whoever, and we are, he's on board exactly what's happening with Fluffy. And next time you go to him for a checkup or for vaccination, chat to him about it. And we're working together as a team. And the pet owner would then remember. So you actually have to be intentional about creating that word of mouth and getting the pet owner, because you want the pet owner to speak about it. And so what would happen is the pet owner would go up and say, oh, so-and-so speaks so highly of you, and I know that you guys work together and this is so wonderful. And then the vet will then ask a few questions about it. And that I used to find really used to solidify my relationship, because then they'd really see that for them, that I held them in high regard, that I was appreciative of them as the referring vet, and that we worked together as a team. So I wasn't there like taking all the credit. I was there actually, showing that they were so important in this outcome for the animal. And that really used to help build up that trust. And the other thing that I used to find really useful is to try and increase your credibility, especially when you're still trying to build up clients, because that word of mouth takes a long time, and it takes a while. It's not something that happens instantly. But the credibility in order to build that trust, you need to be credible. Like you say, if somebody knows that you have published an article, or you're in a magazine or in the newspaper or something, and the pet owner's seen it, the vet's seen it, you suddenly have this increased credibility. And so PR is so important. And I think the whole side of marketing, us vet rehabbers are not great at. We are great at treating our patients. We just spend most of the time, and we put priority in that, which is good. But we have to be consistent in making sure we get ourselves out there. And like you say, showing our value, and showing your value could be writing an article for a newspaper. And I've got loads of tips. And I think there's probably another podcast about how to get into all these publications. And I did a Facebook Live actually with a lady called Rachel Spencer. She's a PR specialist, and she gave
awesome.
some great tips and advice. But we really got to raise our credibility, get that trust, and build those relationships with our vets.
I couldn't agree more. And I love what you said about how to gain that trust and the confidence, because I definitely do that with my clients. Is I want them to know how much I appreciate the work their veterinarian is doing. For example, when I have a patient that has been dealing with chronic allergies, and, I see that their skin is looking great, I say, gosh, I'm so glad that you're seeing Dr. Logan, because she's so excellent at taking care of fluffy skin. He's looking so great. She's such a great veterinarian. And it helps to just further reinforce, again, the mutual trust that you're developing. And I agree, when a client comes to me and they say, my veterinarian said you were amazing and I needed to see you, I make sure I pick up the phone and I call that veterinarian to thank them for that referral, because it's huge that they're coming with that level of confidence to you. And back to your PR, I don't think there's any lack of opportunities right now, particularly with so much online activity happening, but just calling up a local radio station, or just getting out on a blog. I mean, there's multiple different ways that people are connecting, and people are eager to write new articles. And so reaching out to any public medium, that's exactly as you said, it gets you out there and increases your credibility. And as I said, one of the biggest findings beyond understanding that why veterinarians are not referring to rehab is cost, but the other big conclusion of my survey was the need for education. And every time you do something that's PR related, that's education. You're educating your listeners, and that is going to further increase your referral source. It takes a while to educate, but again, look at it as every patient that you have is an opportunity to educate the client, but then the referring veterinarian, and just getting out there the tiniest little bit you can on your Facebook page, on your Instagram, calling a local radio station, any reporting agency locally, getting them to write an article about you, writing a blog. All of that is an opportunity to educate, because, so that was the last question I had on my survey was, would you be interested? Are you wanting to see more education related to rehabilitation? And it was a resounding, more than 90% of respondents said yes, they want more education and rehabilitation. This included the veterinarians who had never referred to rehab. So that is just a wonderful response, because it would have been so sad if these veterinarians were saying, well, I think rehab is really expensive, but honestly, I have no interest in learning about it. But that was not the case. They're saying, you know what, I think rehab's too expensive and that's not what I'm referring, but you know what, I'd really like to learn more about it. And that's great, because that opens the door and the opportunity for us to get that referral, because what we need to change is the perception. It's the increasing the value, understanding that we're going to make you look good. We're going to help take off your hands the patients that you don't want, the ones you're struggling with, and we're going to help send business back to you. And this is a field of medicine that can really help the practice of other veterinarians. And so it all comes back to education. So really getting the word out about what we do, how we can help other veterinarians, is how business comes back to you.
Yeah, and I think each of us have a part to play in that. So this year at Vet Rehab Summit, which is our annual online conference, we actually have around the world networking rooms. And the plan basically is to get everyone in vet rehab globally into a room, and then we'll section them off. And we are basically going to give ideas on how to collaborate to increase this awareness about rehabilitation and how to educate and how we can do it together. So there are a lot of vet rehabbers that are doing Facebook Lives, someone in the States, someone in South Africa, and they're collaborating now to teach people exactly like what you're suggesting now. And we got to work together. All of us got to work together to increase this awareness about veterinary rehabilitation.
100%. That's why I love you, Meg, too, because your forum, Online Pet Health, allows at your fingertips to connect rehab vets worldwide. It's so easy to have that education available to you, and for us to collaborate with each other, it's just phenomenal. So I'm so delighted to know you and that you've put this together, and you're so passionate about helping us as rehab veterinarians. It's amazing. So thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I love what I do. One thing I want to say is that I watched a video. Do you know Simon Sinek? Do you know who he is? He's a British guy, and he has these like videos which are very inspirational. And one of the videos that I watched recently, and it always makes me think about this sort of educating and marketing side of vet rehab, which we tend to push to the side. He gave this example about how if you go to the gym, if you go once a month, all right, you're not going to see any results, all right. If you go like 3 or 4 times a week, even if it's just for half an hour, and you do that consistently over a month, at the end of the month, you start to see some results in your physique. You might lose some weight, tone up a little bit. And when I listened to this, he was saying like you need to be like consistent in the things that you're doing in order to get results. It's consistency. And this really makes me think about marketing. And this is part of it, is obviously educating the vets, is that you've got to be consistent. You can't just say like once every 3 months, I'm going to sit down and do something or phone somebody to try and get an article. It needs to be something that you are doing on a weekly basis and a few times a week. Even if you just say 15 minutes a day, I'm going to either phone a vet or put something out there that's educational. Then if everyone's doing that, you can imagine the reach and the exposure that we'd get for vet rehabilitation.
That's brilliant. And you know what that really reminds me of is the conversation I have with clients, right? Is rehab can't just be once a week when you come to my facility or even twice a week. It's the work you're doing at home. It's that consistency to see the results, just as you said. I hadn't thought about that from a PR perspective, but you're absolutely right. Because I think as with anything, it also, when it becomes habit and we're doing it regularly, it's less of a chore. I think if we're only doing it, once a month, or in my case, it's when I get invited to speak at a conference. But when I have interns and I commit to every day that I'm going to educate whoever I have with me, whether it's a resident or an intern, I'm going to teach them something new about rehab. And then it becomes habit, and it's just part of my day, and it's what I'm doing every day is educating. But you're absolutely right. I just hadn't thought about that. It's a really great way to think of it. Is if you want to see results in your physique, it's going to the gym regularly. It's really true, and it goes in all things in veterinary medicine, right? Is when we start getting our clients doing things regularly, but also for us, if we can do that education regularly, we're going to see better results. Absolutely.
I think it's a great way to explain to clients because they can understand that then. So if you need to use that as a way to get them to do things like home exercises all the time, you can get something that's relatable.
Yeah.
Leilani, thank you so much for sharing all your information about the research. It's really so awesome. And I'm so glad that I found that research article, and we'd love to get a copy of it. Yeah. And if you're happy for me to make it available to people, we can do so. And we'll put a link in the description notes if you want to get that article.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And again, it's such a pleasure to know you, Meg. I really appreciate what you do for the rehab community. And I thank you for having me today.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you get notified every time I load a new podcast. I'm here every week talking to vet rehab therapists from all over the world about all things vet rehab. For more information about continuing education for vet rehab therapists, you can go to onlinepethealth.com. I'd like to thank you for listening to this podcast, and of course, thank our sponsors, Response System. They are as passionate about therapy lasers and PEMF equipment as you are about veterinary rehabilitation. They would love to answer any questions you have, so please feel free to reach out to them at responsesystems.com, or you can email lisa@responsesystems.com.